Hello everyone, I'm Brad from iBUYPOWER, and today we're going to be doing the second part in a two-part series on upgrading your CPU cooler. If you haven't checked out the first video in the series, make sure to take a look at that. That's going to go and cover different types of CPU coolers, what's good and bad about them, and sort of what type of cooler makes the most sense for your CPU. In this video, we're going to be covering the uninstallation and reinstallation portions and kind of breaking that down based on what your system configuration is and kind of all the little minute steps involved. Before we begin, there are a few things that you'll probably want to prepare ahead of time. As always with any of these procedures, make sure your hands are clean and dry before you touch any of the components inside your PC. As far as tools you may need for this procedure, you're going to want a Phillips head screwdriver, something to cut zip ties, probably some extra zip ties to replace when you're done. You're going to want a paper towel or some kind of towel to clean off the thermal paste from your CPU. Optionally, you can also have some isopropyl alcohol to clean up the thermal paste after you're done wiping it off. And if your new cooler doesn't come with thermal paste, probably a tube of replacement thermal paste, but usually the cooler will come with it if it needs it. We also suggest, if possible, to have a helper, a second person to help you out, because there are going to be parts of this procedure where you may need 3 hands, so having someone to help you out will help a lot. So if your system has an all-in-one liquid cooler like this, you'll notice that the cooler has 2 major components. One is the water block, which goes on top of the CPU, and the other is the radiator. And the radiator can be mounted in a couple of different locations in the case. We have 3 examples here. So on this side, we have a rear-mounted radiator. This is usually where a smaller 120 or 140 millimeter radiator will go. In the middle, we have a top-mounted radiator. And then over here on the side, we have a front-mounted radiator. So these 2 are going to be more what you'll typically see for a larger 2 or 3 fan radiator. They're either going to be mounted on the top or on the front. And the way that you're going to access these coolers kind of differs a little bit between them. For a case where the cooler is mounted on the top, usually there's some sort of dust filter or plate that you'll have to remove to access the screws that are on the top here. For a rear mounted cooler like this, usually there's nothing covering it. You can see the screws right away to remove them. And then for the front mounted cooler, you will have to remove the front panel. So we're going to focus on the front mounted cooler for the purposes of this video, just because it's the most complicated, and any of the other variations, the process will be the same. There's just going to be less stuff to do because there's less things to remove in the rear mounted and top mounted methods. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to the beginning of the uninstallation steps for removing the cooler that's already in your system. For this video, we will be treating it as though you are replacing a liquid cooler with another liquid cooler. If you are instead removing an air cooler or installing an air cooler, like one of those tower heat sinks we showed in the previous video, the steps are going to be very similar. The major difference is you're only going to be paying attention to the part where we mount the water block to the CPU, and you can kind of ignore all of the steps about how to uninstall or reinstall the radiator, because they don't have 2 parts, they only have 1. Again, this PC has the radiator mounted up front, so we're going to need to remove the front panel of the case in order to access it. So to remove the front panel, for most of our cases, it's pretty simple. You just reach up under the front part of the case. There should be a gap that you can get your fingertips under, and then you just give it a nice sharp pull. And the front panel should come off. Once we remove the front panel, that should expose the screws that hold both the front fans onto the case, and then also the radiator onto the inside. Before we start undoing some of the screws holding the radiator and the fans in place, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these components are going to have wires connected to them to provide power or lighting or something like that. So for each fan that's mounted to the radiator in your system, there's usually going to be at least 1 wire, right? So there's going to be a wire that connects either to the motherboard or to a fan header to provide the power to spin the fan motor. If you have an RGB fan, you might have 2 wires, right? So 1 to power the fan motor and 1 to actually light up the lights in the fan. Other RGB fans may have these combined into 1 cable, but just know that each fan usually is going to have some wires that you're going to have to follow around. In addition to the fans having wires, usually there is also a pump as part of the liquid cooler assembly. The pump can be in one of two places. So in this cooler here, the pump is actually located in the radiator, and you can see that there is a power cable for that pump. So it's another thing you'll have to look out for. In other coolers, the pump may be located actually in the water block, in which case you'll have a wire coming out of that. This particular cooler also has RGB lighting, so you'll see that there is an RGB header to provide lighting to the pump cap. Keep track of all these things because all of those are going to be wires that you're going to have to fish out of the system to uninstall the old cooler, and then you're going to have to reroute them and plug them back in when you're installing your new one. Most of the wires are going to be run behind the motherboard tray. You're not going to see them on this side of the PC. They're going to be behind this panel here. So we're going to go ahead and remove that panel. There should normally just be 2 screws at the back, and then the panel will slide back and away from the case. Put this somewhere where we won't knock it over. For first timers, this looks pretty intimidating, right? There's a lot of wires going a lot of places. One thing I recommend doing before you start messing with any of the wiring is to actually take your smartphone or a camera and then take a picture of all the wiring in the case. That way you know kind of how to put it back together again. Each of the fans is going to have at least one wire. The pump for the liquid cooler is going to have a wire. Probably the RGB on any device is going to have its own wire. So we're going to start going through this system and finding all of those wires and going through and clipping these twist ties or the zip ties that hold them in place. Again, the first thing I'm going to be looking at is all the fans that are mounted to this cooler here in the front. This particular case has 3 RGB fans that are mounted to the front. These ones are not part of the cooler assembly, so we can leave these on the case and remove the radiator without having to worry about dealing with the wiring for the RGB fans. If those fans were mounted here to the back of the cooler, we would have to worry about that. So right now I'm just looking for the wires that are connecting to these 2 fans here. You can kind of see them coming out of the bottom corner here. I'm going to trace these wires around through the back of the case. They're going to go through a couple of zip tie points, and then I can see actually they come back around again up here where they plug into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. So now that we've located the wire, we're going to have to kind of uncable manage it. So that's probably going to involve clipping some zip ties. So again, we've found the path of the wire itself, and I'm going to go in with my cutter here and cut these zip ties. You're going to want to make sure when you do this to be very careful not to cut the wires themselves. Just try to keep the blades of your cutter around just the zip tie itself. Right now that we've cut the zip ties, I'm going to go ahead and fish both of these wires out of here. So we have one fan wire for the bottom fan, and then we have another one over here for the top fan. Get both of these wires out onto this side of the case. So now we've freed up the wires for the fans on the radiator, and then we're going to go after the wires that plug into the water block. There's 2 wires we're looking for. You can pretty easily see them here coming out of the right side of the pump. And again, one of them is for the pump motor. So that would be this one here. You can see that it plugs in to a fan header. So I'm just going to unplug that. And then again, bring it out to this side of the case where it's free. And then the other wire is going to be the RGB connector. So I'm going to go follow that to where it plugs into this RGB hub back here, and then unplug that and fish this whole wire assembly out here. Okay, we've got all of our cables freed. Now it's time to actually start removing the components of the cooler from the case. So the first thing I'm going to do is detach the radiator here from the front of the case. Again, if you have a system where this radiator is mounted to the top or the back, this is kind of where all those steps will start to line up again. The only difference is sort of which side of the case you're attacking it from. The way that this cooler is mounted, as you can see, there is a fan in the front, then the cooler, then a fan in the back. This is usually known as push-pull configuration. There's a fan pushing air into the radiator and then another fan pulling air out of the radiator. And the way that these things mount is a little bit different than if this radiator was mounted directly to the case itself, as you may see, for example, with a top-mounted radiator where there isn't enough space to fit 2 fans, one on each side. So the way that this is going to mount is actually with these long fan screws. I will remove one and show you what I'm talking about. These are long fan screws. Sometimes they're also called radiator screws. They're usually 632 thread. These are important to keep track of just because they are the screws that go through fans to mount them to the radiator. And usually if you have a push-pull configuration like this, these are the types of screws that will be used to make that happen. The strategy for mounting a push-pull radiator to the case is going to be that screws are alternated on the diagonal holes on the fan. So what I'm talking about is, right, your fan, pretend this is the fan up here, has one hole on each corner, and you're going to have one screw on opposite corners actually mounting the fan to the case itself, and then you're going to have the other opposite corners with these long fan screws connecting to the radiator. So just in case you mess up, you're trying to find these screws and let's say you can't see which one is which, if you remove one of the other screws and it's the wrong kind, you will get one of these fan screws. So these have a much coarser thread on them, and they're designed to thread directly into the plastic frame of the fan. If you run into one of these, I would just put it back, because if you remove all the screws from all the fans in the front, those front fans will fall off too, and you don't want that. You just want to remove the screws that are holding the radiator in place. And again, usually those will be on the diagonals. So we got this first diagonal screw here, and then we're going to go for the opposite diagonal. Sometimes the screw heads are different looking, so that'll help you figure out which one is which. And we got a 240 radiator in the front, so we're looking for 4 screws. So again, we're going to go along the diagonal here, and just keep in mind once you get the last screw off that the radiator will come down. So at this point, before you start trying to unmount the radiator from your case, you're actually going to want to lay the system down on its side on your work surface, just so that if stuff does fall, it doesn't like fall out onto the desk or fall onto another component. It'll usually just drop like an inch or so like onto the case next to it. For the purposes of this video in the studio, we're actually going to keep the case up on its side here. And that's just so you can see what I'm doing. But again, when you're following along at home, you want to make sure that the case is laying on its side. So now that you've gotten the radiator kind of unscrewed from the front of the case, you're going to want to remove it from the case so that it doesn't get in the way of anything. So again, you'll have yours laying on its side like this. Just sort of drape the cooler outside the system like that, and again, that way, you know, it doesn't flop around and you know, whack into another component while you're working on removing the water block. Before we move on to actually removing the water block from the top of the CPU, depending on how cramped your workspace is, right, there are other components that might get in the way here. If you feel like you need a little bit more space, you can do things like remove your graphics card or remove the RAM next to the CPU cooler and kind of get you better access to the area around the CPU. For the purposes of this guide, we're actually going to break out into multiple different scenes at this point, because the way that this guide will proceed will change based on which CPU, motherboard, and socket type you have. So go ahead and check the timeline in the description and match it up to what kind of CPU and socket you have, and those chapters will kind of line up with the way that these steps will progress. So this part of the guide is going to cover the uninstall and reinstall process for AM4 motherboards that are reusing the stock plastic retention clip on the motherboard. There's going to be 2 different types of coolers that use this. The first one is going to be an air cooler. So if your AM4 motherboard does not come with one of these retention brackets pre-installed, you may have to purchase one of these separately. To install it back onto the board is pretty easy. It just has 4 screws that go into the corner. So it's symmetrical, there's no top or bottom. You just line this up with the holes on the board. And put these screws in. And that's it, you're good. So this is a OEM style fan mounted to an AM4 motherboard that uses the factory retention clips. So you'll notice that this heatsink has clips on both sides that grip this plastic piece, as well as this release paddle, which relieves the tension on the spring that's here. So to remove these coolers, the first thing you're going to usually do is to unflip that lever, which relieves the tension on the spring that's holding this in place. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to try and push this leaf spring here all the way to one side, and that will help you to lift one of these clips off of the plastic clip under it. Once you have one of them free, the other one is usually very easy to get free. One thing to note with AMD AM4 CPU specifically is that because the CPU is not mechanically gripped into the socket itself, they do have a tendency to get basically suction cupped onto the bottom of coolers. So before you attempt to remove the cooler, what we recommend doing is just giving the cooler a very slight wobble side to side to release it from the CPU itself, then you can remove it. So right away, you'll notice there will be some thermal paste left on both the cooler half and the CPU itself. Usually there will be more than this. So this is just staged for the purpose of this video, but that's where you're going to want to grab your paper towel and then wipe off the thermal paste that is on both sides. Be very careful when you're doing this. You don't want to get this stuff on your fingers. You definitely don't want to get it on your clothes. It's very hard to wash out. So we just recommend taking your paper towel and wiping off as much of it as you can from both the cooler side and the CPU. It's usually pretty easy to scrub the majority of it off with just a paper towel. And again, you want to dispose of this right away just so that it doesn't get on your hands and it doesn't get onto your clothes. If you notice that there is some residue of thermal paste left on the CPU and you want to get it especially clean, you can use isopropyl alcohol to kind of really get it cleaned up. So main thing to remember for the alcohol is do not pour it directly onto your CPU, obviously. What you're gonna want to do usually is to just get a little paper towel over the top of your container and give it a shake just to kind of moisten the towel a little bit. And then you can use that to really clean off the top of your CPU. And there is a little bit left over there, so. Now for reinstalling the cooler, some coolers will come with thermal paste pre-applied. If your cooler does not, then you will have to apply thermal paste to the CPU. We usually recommend a pea-sized dot in the middle of the CPU. So about that much. There's a lot of different strategies that people will suggest for this, including making patterns like an X or a square, or spreading it out with a paddle, but we find that this is probably the easiest to do and usually works pretty well. So next, you're going to prepare your cooler and seat it down on top of the socket, trying to make sure to keep it centered. And again, we have these clips here on the side. The easiest way to do is to start with the side that it does not have the plastic paddle and get that hooked onto the clip here. And once you've got this side on, then you can turn it around. It's usually a little easier to get the other side hooked into place. And you can just go ahead and flip that paddle, and that should get everything nice and tightened down. Make sure you plug your CPU fan in, and then you should be ready to go. So this will be for a liquid cooler mounted to an AM4 socket motherboard that does reuse the stock plastic retention clips. As you'll notice with this cooler, it has these two little spring screws on either side with these little paddles that grip onto those plastic clips. So to remove this cooler, what you're going to need to do first is relieve some of the tension on both of these springs so that you can remove those clips. So I'm going to loosen these up. Usually you don't need to take them all the way off. Sometimes you will. Since you'll be working on this inside a case, we usually recommend to try and leave them hooked onto the little screws here. That way you don't have something fall and kind of like fall into the bottom of your case and you have to go find it. So now that those are loosened, we should be able to push down on them, unhook from the clip. So next we're going to want to clean the thermal paste off of our old cooler. That's what our paper towels here were for. Make sure not to touch this. Don't get it on your clothes. It is very hard to wash off, and it's bad for you if you ingest it. So that's what we have our paper towels here for. Just wipe that off. That's it for that one. This is the installation steps for installing a cooler onto socket AM4 or AM5 motherboard that reuses the retention mechanism that came with the motherboard. So if your AM4 motherboard does not come with one of these retention brackets pre-installed, you may have to purchase one of these separately. To install it back onto the board is pretty easy. It just has 4 screws that go into the corner. So it's symmetrical, there's no top or bottom. You just line this up with the holes on the board. And put these screws in. And that's it, you're good. So usually there's going to be some sort of mounting plate that attaches to the CPU water block, as well as some clips that will catch onto the factory retention mechanism. So usually you're going to want to assemble this before putting it on the cooler. So for this particular one, we are going to insert these pieces onto these tabs on each side with these screws. And then we are going to slide this onto our cooler's water block like this. Grab our board. If your cooler does not come with thermal paste pre-applied, you may have to apply thermal paste to the CPU. We recommend placing a pea-sized dot in the middle of the CPU and using the mounting pressure of the cooler to help spread that out. What we're going to want to do is try to catch one side onto this plastic clip and then the other side. Once you've got one side on, it's a lot easier to get the other one than trying to do both at the same time. You get one to catch, and you can kind of use these screws to steer a little bit. And then once we've got one side on, it's pretty easy to get the other side on. You'll notice it's very loose once we tighten down these screws. Usually for CPU coolers, when you have screws like this, you're gonna wanna kind of alternate back and forth. And that'll help to apply a more even pressure to get that thermal paste to stick. In this case, the screws will actually bottom out and you'll hit a resistance point, and that kind of tells you when you've reached the correct mounting pressure. This is for AMD socket AM4 motherboards where the CPU cooler uses the stock backplate from the factory retention mechanism, but does not use the plastic clips that go on the top. So these pieces have been removed. To remove these is pretty simple. Almost all of them are gonna work kind of the same way, where you're just gonna have 4 screws around the corner of either the heatsink and fan or your liquid cooler. So you're just going to unscrew those 4 screws. And with all of these types of mounting mechanisms where you have screws on each corner, it's generally a good idea to go about them in an X pattern, both when you're loosening them and tightening them. That way you don't apply or relieve pressure unevenly. So you just back these off until they're fully out of their little holes. So this is the installation of a cooler onto a AMD socket AM4 motherboard that reuses the factory backplate. So that's this piece, but does not reuse the black plastic clips that normally come on the top. So if your AM4 motherboard does not come with one of these retention brackets pre-installed, you may have to purchase one of these separately. To install it back onto the board is pretty easy. It just has 4 screws that go into the corner. So it's symmetrical, there's no top or bottom. You just line this up with the holes on the board. So most of these types of coolers are going to have 4 screws on the corners that just line up with the receiving ends on the back plate there. If your cooler does not come with thermal paste pre-applied, you will have to apply thermal paste directly to the CPU. We usually recommend a pea-sized dot in the middle of the CPU. Make sure to line up each of these screws with the posts that are coming out of the back plate before you start trying to screw them in. And then when you're going through, make sure to tighten them in an X pattern. And what I mean by that is don't go around the screws in a circle. Start with one corner, give it just a few turns, move to the opposite corner, give that one a few turns. Then do the other 2 corners opposite each other, and you don't want to fully tighten them on the first go around. Just like I said, give each one a few turns and then go back to the first one, and then you can go ahead and bottom that one out. Okay, and then the last thing would just be to make sure to plug in your CPU fan. This is a AMD socket AM4 motherboard with a liquid cooler that is not using the factory retention clips, but is reusing the stock backplate. These coolers are usually going to be mounted with 4 screws, 1 at each corner. Depending on your style of cooler, these may either be nuts in the case of this one here. So I will take one of these off, and you can see that this is actually like a thumb nut, and then there is a screw that protrudes out from the motherboard. Sometimes this is going to be a screw that goes straight into the board itself. Since these are thumb nuts, I can undo them by hand, but they usually also will have a Phillips head on the top if it gets really stuck. It's also usually you don't have this much space to work around inside the system. And that will free the cooler from the CPU. So remember to clean off your thermal paste. This cooler also has these standoffs which screw into the factory backplate, so we're going to have to remove those as well. They're basically just spacers. Clean off our thermal paste off the CPU. This is an installation of a cooler onto a AMD socket AM4 motherboard that is not reusing the factory retention clips, and these have been removed. So if your AM4 motherboard does not come with one of these retention brackets pre-installed, you may have to purchase one of these separately. To install it back onto the board is pretty easy. It just has 4 screws that go into the corner. So it's symmetrical, there's no top or bottom. You just line this up with the holes on the board. The first thing that we're going to want to do is install these standoffs into the holes on the motherboard. So these are just going to screw in by hand. Next, we are going to install the mounting plate onto our CPU cooler. There we go. Okay, we got this bracket on, and then the next thing is going to be to apply thermal paste onto the CPU if the cooler doesn't already have it. Blob. Seat that down onto those things. Grab the thumb nuts and apply them an X pattern. Finish them off with a screwdriver. Okay, that's it for that one. This is on a mainstream Intel board, so either socket 115X or socket 1700, and this would be a 2-piece cooler mounting. So this is going to be very common for heatsink and fan assemblies like this, and also some liquid coolers. The only real difference between them is for the heatsink and fan assembly, you're probably going to need to take the fan off. Usually they have some kind of clips on the side to just remove those. You're going to need to get that out of the way because usually you need to reach these two screws here. Sometimes you might also need to remove some RAM. Our board doesn't have it. So then once you have access to all 4 corner screws, it's pretty simple. You just start backing off those screws a little bit at a time in an X pattern until the cooler comes loose. One thing to keep in mind with these kinds of coolers, especially on Intel motherboards where every cooler for the most part needs a backplate, is that once the cooler is free from the CPU, the backplate will fall off. So if you're doing this in a case, sometimes this thing has a habit of falling off and like hiding somewhere in the case, so just make sure to keep an eye on it. This is a 2-part cooler install for mainstream Intel motherboard, so this will cover 11.5X and socket 1700. The only real difference between the 2 sockets is the size of the mounting hole pattern, and you'll just have to make sure that your cooler backplate is designed for whichever socket you have. Some of these have sliding nuts on them. This one is fixed, so you will need to make sure that your cooler comes with the correct one. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is put the backplate onto the motherboard. If you're doing this in a system, it may be a little bit hard to do this if you don't have someone to help you. One of the tips that we have actually is if you get a small box like this, you can actually place your backplate on top of it, and that kind of raises it off the table and makes it a little bit easier to place it behind your motherboard like this. So it kind of keeps things off the table. Some of these also do have adhesive on them, so you could just sort of stick it onto the back of the board with the adhesive, but not everyone does, so we're going to assume that it does not. Okay, once you have your backplate in place and you can see that all of the nuts are sticking through the holes on the motherboard, then it's pretty easy to just install the cooler. You just have these 4 screws, 1 on each corner. They do tend to be held in place like this and have springs on them, so it's pretty easy to keep track of. If your cooler does not come with thermal paste pre-applied, we're going to go ahead and apply that. Apply a pea-sized blob of thermal paste to the middle of the CPU, and then get our cooler lined up on each of the 4 corners. And then we're going to just give a few turns on each corner to get the threads to bite, and we are moving in an X pattern rather than going in a circle, and this helps to ensure even pressure with the thermal paste spread. Go ahead and bottom these out now. If you have a liquid cooler, you're done. If you have an air cooler, then you just have to mount your fan. Usually the fans will have these clips like this that go onto the side, 1 on each side, and then they will notch into the fins on the cooler. This is cooler uninstallation of a 3-piece mounting kit on a Intel socket 1700 or 11.5X motherboard. Just like a lot of the other Intel platforms, you start by undoing the 4 corner screws, and once these are undone, you can remove them. Set these aside. You can remove your CPU water block. Make sure to clean this. Then we can remove these standoffs, which screw into the backplate. Once these things have all been removed, the backplate does have a tendency to fall off, so keep track of that. This is installation of a 3-part mounting kit liquid cooler to a Intel socket 1700 motherboard. These instructions will also apply to an Intel socket 11.5X motherboard. The mounting methods are basically the same. The only thing you have to watch out for is the size of the backplate. Make sure that if you have a fixed backplate like this, that it is sized correctly for your motherboard. The first thing you're going to want to do is actually mount that backplate to the motherboard. Unlike a 2-piece mounting kit, this one you don't really need someone to help you or anything to hold it in place, because once you place the back plate behind the board, you do have these standoffs that you can screw in, and that will keep that in place while you mount the rest of the cooler. So yeah, once you get 2 corners in, it'll kind of stay in place for you. All right, so that's prepped. Now, next thing you're gonna wanna do is add the top part of the mounting kit onto your CPU cooler water block. So usually there's just a notch to slide that in like this. And now that's ready. If your cooler doesn't have thermal paste pre-applied, you will have to apply it to the CPU. And can go ahead and come up, get our cooler lined up on the socket, and then we can grab these nuts and start putting them onto the standoffs. You do want to go in that X pattern rather than in a circle. So once you have them mostly in place, before you start to really tighten them down, you want to go in a pattern like this. So opposite corners. All right, and that's it. This is uninstallation of a 2-part mounting kit liquid cooler on Intel socket 1700. These instructions will also apply to socket 11.5X. So it's pretty simple. Like most of the Intel mounting kits, you have 1 screw on each corner, 4 corners. So you can just go ahead and start undoing those screws a little bit at a time. And it's best if you move in an alternating pattern instead of going in a circle. That helps relieve the pressure on the socket more evenly. All right, once you've got all the corner screws off, you can go ahead and lift the water block off the CPU. Be aware that with these 2-piece kits, once you have removed the water block, the back plate will tend to fall off the motherboard. So if you're doing this in your case, you're gonna have to make sure to keep track of this. Right, so this is installation of a 2-piece mounting kit cooler onto an Intel socket 1700 motherboard. These instructions will also apply to socket 11.5X. The only thing to make sure of is that your backplate, if it is a fixed backplate, will match the holes on your motherboard. So the first thing we're going to do is prep the top half of the mounting kit by mounting it onto the water block. All right. So now that we've got the top half of our mounting bracket mounted, we're going to put the backplate onto the motherboard. If your backplate does not have adhesive strips like this, it may be a little difficult because it'll tend to fall away from the board if you don't have someone else to hold that backplate up to the board for you. You can use like a small box, put it on your work surface, put the backplate on it. That'll keep it elevated so that it's a little bit easier to get it lined up with your board. Then once that's in place, if your cooler does not come with thermal paste pre-applied, you can apply thermal paste to your CPU. You can go ahead and place the cooler. Make sure to line up all of the screws with the receiving ends before you start tightening anything. Then give each corner a couple of turns just to make sure that the threads bite. Then once you are sure everything is lined up, then you can go ahead and start cranking them down. Make sure to go in an alternating pattern rather than in a circle around the water block. That helps ensure even mounting pressure and even distribution of the thermal paste. All right, and that's all there is to it. This is removal of a liquid cooler from an Intel socket 20XX motherboard. So this will cover socket 2066 and 2011. So pretty simple. Cooler usually is going to have 4 screws or nuts at each corner. So we're just going to go ahead and start backing off those. And then once they're a little loose, we can undo them by hand. Right. So out of the way, we can lift our cooler off. Make sure to clean the thermal paste off of our cooler. And then we will remove the 4 corner standoffs and we're done. This is liquid cooler installation on an Intel socket 20XX motherboard. So this will cover socket 2011 and 2066. So this one's a little bit more simple because the mounting plate is always permanently in these motherboards. So usually it's just a standoff on each corner, and then we will install the top bracket. All right, and then if the cooler does not have thermal paste pre-applied, we will apply some to the CPU. Go ahead and get the water block lined up on these standoffs, and then put the thumb nuts on one at a time. Once we have them kind of in place, then we can go through and tighten them, going a little bit at a time in an alternating pattern. That will ensure more even pressure distribution and better spread of the thermal paste. And that's all there is to it. All right, so we've gotten our CPU water block installed, tightened down, everything looks good, fans are mounted onto the radiator, so the last few steps are just gonna be to kind of put this system back together. For the most part, it's just gonna be a reverse of all the steps we took to get to this point, but I'll walk through them, you know, just to make sure. So again, we've got our water block mounted, we've got our fans on our radiator, so the next step is going to be to screw the radiator onto the front of the case, and we're going to be using those same long fan screws that we had before. Okay, we've got our radiator installed. Now I can stand the case back up again without having to worry about things falling. And then the only thing we have to worry about is the wiring. So if you remember, we got one wire for each fan. We also have the RGB and pump wires for our water block. So, you know, I'm gonna start pulling these through to the other side of the case so that I can start doing my cable management. Okay, so I've got all the wires put back together. I haven't gone and put the zip ties back in and redone cable management. Usually at this point, we would recommend firing the system up, making sure that things are working, you know, go into BIOS, check CPU temperatures and make sure the fans are spinning and stuff like that before you spend all the time to kind of, you know, cable manage everything real nice and then find out that something was loose or a fan is jammed or something like that. So like I said, this would be where, you know, our cable management is not perfect. We still need to cinch a lot of these wires down, but I would fire the PC up, plug it into a monitor, and check temps before making everything look nice again. If you need some advice on how to do that, we actually do have another video on stress testing your PC. We'll have a link in the description. You can check that out. It kind of goes through some of the popular pieces of software that you can download that are free and use it to kind of check the performance of your CPU cooler. Well, hopefully you found this guide helpful. You know, if you have any questions or concerns, you know, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We're always there on Discord and Reddit. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.